This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I am your host, Dina Sabry Fivaz, and I'm a transition coach and founder of Agape Heart and Soul. In this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to experts, coaches, and thought leaders who share their passion for being a coach versus doing coaching, for coaching beyond tools. Our aim is to challenge ourselves as coaches to reconsider some of the prevailing thinking around what good coaching looks like and to inspire ourselves to dare and truly show up within the coaching relationship. A very warm welcome to our listeners. This is our first episode in the AC podcast series, Coaching Beyond Tools. And I'm here with John Leary-Joyce. John, welcome.
Lovely. It's fantastic to be here.
Absolutely. It would be a total understatement to tell you just how excited I am to have this conversation with you today and have this air as our first episode. I'd love to explore with you the use of self. But before we do that, what would you like our listeners to know about you, John?
Oh, wow. That I'm absolutely passionate about Gestalt. I started when I was 22, and so 45 years I've been practicing Gestalt and learning and developing all the time. It's an amazing framework, philosophy, methodology that I learn more and more every day about it, and hope in this podcast to convey the learning that I've gleaned over the years and how it applies to coaching.
I think you're also quite versatile in your work, John, aren't you? When I've known you as my Gestalt Coach trainer, my coach, my supervisor. I know you have a background in Gestalt therapy.
Yes.
You work with Peter Hawkins, I think, with some team stuff.
Yes. So I love training and teaching. Obviously, I'm very keen practitioner, and it's a real pleasure to talk with coaches around helping them understand in terms of supervision what's working, what doesn't work, and ways of improving.
Fantastic. So as I was researching a little bit about use of self as a way to prepare for our episode today, John, I actually looked at the Association for Coaching because, of course, they also have a competency framework for coaches. And I was delighted to see that. So competency number 6 is around raising awareness and insight. And within that, the very last sentence talks about what coaches need to do to raise awareness. And I'll quote this one. It says, "Coach uses self as a resource for the development of the client's self-awareness and learning by offering here and now feedback." I think it couldn't get more gestalty in the wording. I'm not sure who wrote it, but I thought it was such a beautiful statement. And I know that a lot of coaches I meet and speak with, when they see these words, use of self, it can feel quite confusing. Like there's a wonder about, well, what does that really mean? What are we meant to do or not do when it talks about use of self? So maybe we could start with a bit of a definition, John. Like for you, when you hear the words use of self, what does that mean? What could that look like?
Well, when we come to the coaching relationship, we bring ourselves. We show up. We share our knowledge, our expertise, usually in the form of questions. That's traditionally how we learn to coach. But where do those questions come from? They come from our own internal hypotheses, ideas, theories, experiences. And generally, we're taught to turn that background thinking into a question, because you don't want to lead the client. This is what most coaches are concerned with. Am I going to lead the client? If I share, do what it says in the competencies. If I share myself, am I influencing the client? And my answer is yes, of course you are. Your very presence, even if you're online, your very presence influences the coaching. And my suggestion, or my process and the whole notion of use of self, is bringing that and being explicit about what's happening to you internally as the coach, and making that clear and explicit and transparent. And in the doing of that, there comes a greater sense of connection and dialogue. So we use ourselves in service of the client in the same way as the competence is saying, in order to raise awareness for the client, in order for them to grow and develop.
let's go back to the last part, and then maybe I go back a bit further back. But you mentioned about how this is to create a greater sense of connection and dialogue. And I know you very often introduce Gestalt coaching that it has a very important relational and dialogical aspect. So could you maybe talk a bit more about that? Why is that important, the relational and dialogical aspects of it?
Well, we know from well over 100 years of research in psychotherapy is that the single most important factor in the healing of the patient, the client, is the quality of the connection between the therapist and the patient. So if we know that, why not maximize it? And so Gestalt is founded on the basis of it's the quality of connection. Gestalt is all about how do we make the best connection at every single moment in time and feel satisfied with that connection. Therefore, of course, the relationship between the coach and the client has to be the primary concern, the primary focus. So we are starting off from that basic principle and underpinned by the notion of dialogue, which is the quality then of connection that creates the richness that comes from us meeting someone at a profound and intimate level.
What I'm hearing behind what you're saying, John, is that to be able to create that depth in the relationship and have that connection with our clients, there needs to be some kind of self-disclosure. I guess use of self is something, I'm disclosing something about myself, whether it's what I'm observing, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, We'll talk about more about that self-disclosure and what's maybe appropriate and what's not. But there's something about, as I disclose more about myself, I'm also allowing that relationship and that connection to deepen in the service of the client's expansion of his or her awareness.
Of course, yes. If you simply ask questions, which is quite traditional, you don't disclose much of yourself. So if I say, well, I'm just looking at the paintings on your background, I say, well, who painted that picture behind you? You can answer the question, of course, but it doesn't disclose the fact that as I look at the picture, I'm entranced by it. I'm looking at it, I'm curious about it. And if I say, look, I'm fascinated by that picture that you've got on your wall, did you paint it? Because it's quite extraordinary. In the second way, what you know is something about me. I have disclosed something about my interest. What was the thinking behind my question? And in sharing what we call, what's the statement behind your question? When we share that, we disclose more of ourselves, and then you get to know me, and then I get to know you. So that connection builds and grows. And if the quality of the connection is the single most important factor in change, then we're maximizing that aspect of our work together.
I think probably what it also does is it adds a sense of maybe honesty or authenticity, I guess, because as a coach, I also have had coaches and still have a coach. And sometimes if the approach is very much focused on the questions, you get to feel like they're leading me somewhere. They're thinking something, but they're not saying it, and they're trying to take me there. And I just rather they just say it. What's on your mind?
Exactly.
And I think what you're saying is encouraging us to share the thought behind it as a way to connect, as a way to be. This congruency from Rogers comes to mind. One of his 6 conditions is being congruent.
Absolutely. That was the major shift in the 60s. And the humanistic movement was shifting away from the doctor-patient model, where the expert doctor had the answer, to 2 people engaged in dialogue, equal, but one had one role and the other had a different role. In my early training, my trainer used to say it's 2 people engaged to benefit the awareness of one. So the focus of the coach is to build awareness of the other, but of course you're bringing yourself, your awareness of yourself into the picture. And in a Gestalt point perspective, that's really the most important focus.
I don't know if I ever shared with you this, but the way I got to connect with you in the first place and be so interested in Gestalt coaching was that when I was first doing my certificate in coaching, in one particular day where we're introduced in different types of psychological approaches to coaching, and of course the majority of them come from the therapy Carl Rogers was one, person-centered coaching. And then Gestalt coaching came at some point. And then the instructor, she explained what Gestalt was about. And I was like, that seems very fuzzy. I don't understand what this is. I'm not sure I will ever be doing this, but I was still curious. And then she showed a demo of you coaching someone. And I remember it was relatively long. I don't remember how long it was, but it was maybe 7-10 minutes. It was a nice chunk of demo. And there were maybe 5 or 10 seconds, but I was shocked and in awe at the same time. And I was like, who is this man? So you were exploring some kind of an image or a metaphor with this client. And at some point you asked her, what was the color? And before she even answered what she saw in her image as the color, you offered your image and so you're like, oh, I imagine it to be, I don't know, let's say blue. And I was like, what has he done? Like, you asked a question, but you didn't wait for the client to answer it. And immediately afterwards, you shared your own thinking, your own feeling behind it. Now, obviously, this is a demo, and you probably don't know which demo I'm talking about, but I imagine that happens in your own coaching and your own supervision. And I'm just curious, why would one do this? I mean, I know you mentioned it's something about the connection, but what else happens as maybe we share what we see in an image, in a metaphor, in a color?
So if we are focusing on the quality of the connection, the relational perspective of it, what I'm focusing on is the impact that you are having on me right now at any point. So when the client shares a metaphor, I'm immediately absorbing that metaphor and noticing, how do I make sense of that metaphor? What happens to me? And if I have an image, then why not share it? This is what the impact it's having on me, and therefore I would want to contribute that to the relationship.
I think that probably brings me back to when we first talking and you were talking about that influence, that when I share and have used myself in the session, some coaches are concerned about, well, would I now be influencing the client? And you said, yeah, of course we're influencing. Our mere presence influences. And that reminds me also, especially when I speak with coaches who, for example, are, let's say, clean language coaches, because there it's very strict. No, I mean, clean language also comes from therapy. I think it was a Grove. I don't know if it was David Grove or
David Grove, yes.
And so it has that aspect of, I'm dealing with patients and I don't want to bring my own stuff. I think he would even go to I don't have direct eye contact, with the patient. I only use their words and so on. But within coaching, I hear a concern from coaches who use clean language say, yeah, but when we influence this way, aren't we contaminating, I think is the word, or polluting the space? And I guess what you're saying is, yeah.
Yes, definitely. I've had clean language coaching and I find it really useful. And being that specific and coming at it very clean is absolutely one approach. I don't happen to find that engaging. I don't happen to find a delight. I didn't find it much fun to do. It became a little bit mechanistic. So I missed that connection in my practice. So Gestalt is really the antithesis of clean language. It is very much about bringing yourself to focus on the quality of the connection, not just simply my own intrapersonal, but our interpersonal dialogue. And the question that always comes up is, but is this my stuff? And how do I know if it's my stuff or the client's stuff? And of course, the answer is, it's all your stuff, all of it. It's always the coach's stuff. But it's kind of interesting. Why did your stuff get stimulated at that particular point? So when my client talks a metaphor and is about, I might ask, what's your color? But I might also be obviously having a color in my mind because I'm really engaged and connected. So I have a color that comes up. Now, it is my color. And the important thing is that I am sharing my perspective. I'm not saying it's your color. And that's when there is a concern about, am I directing or not? You become directing whenever you think that your perspective, and it could be in the form of a question, is right. You are taking the client down your direction, not in my framework. You're offering a gift of another perspective. And to me, that is less directive than a clever question that covers up your direction in the form of an open question. So I think your questions are your stuff, and so are the statements and the perspectives that come from it as well. And then the question is, how do you frame that in a way that allows the coach to take your gift and play with it? ICF, very similar competency, but the way they say it is, how do you offer that without attachment? And I think that's a lovely way of putting it. You are offering it, and if it's not acceptable, you let it go.
And I think what I'm hearing is that instead of thinking of it as it's contaminating or polluting my relationship or the space between me and my client, is to think of it more as there's an enrichment. There's something that happens between us. And therefore, my sharing the impact that you have on me or your words have on me is a way to deepen and enrich what's happening between us.
Lovely. Yes. So it's enriching. Definitely.
Yeah. Isaacs wrote this book, Dialogue, and in it he explains how the word abracadabra, typical word for magic, it's an Aramaic word that means I create as I speak. And I found there's something really beautiful about this idea of our having this, again, relational, dialogical relationship. And through dialogue and words and you sharing and me sharing, magic is being created. There's something special that goes beyond the individual pieces, like you and me in a session. So much more.
And that fits with the Gestalt paradox of change created by Arnold Beiser. He said, change occurs when we become who we are, which is fascinating. Change happens when we accept who we are. And it is that process of listening and accepting the other in a non-judgmental way that is the basis of our coaching practice. And the Gestalt just takes that to the extreme and saying we are listening together and we are sharing together and we are accepting together. And I, as the coach, am accepting that I have this response to you. And in that moment, we are connecting together, we are being together. And of course, we are seeing what emerges. So the other aspect of Gestalt is that we're not working towards a solution. We're allowing the process to emerge, to unfold in the relationship.
It's fascinating. So then, is there then a space for goals within a Gestalt coaching relationship?
If you're sticking purely to Gestalt, the only goal is awareness. If you're going down a purist route, obviously it's an integration and you're doing some performance coaching along with it. So yes, you might want to use goals, but from a Gestalt perspective, that's not necessary. We allow the emergence to happen and we trust the process of being together, that the most important unfinished Gestalt, the unfinished business, will emerge in the relationship and will be resolved. Gestalt has this wonderful optimistic view that if we stay open to the mess or the difficulty, it will resolve itself. We resolve ourselves and we just have to allow that to happen. Now, primarily basic coaching does that, but they do that through a whole series of investigation through questions. Gestalt does it through just let's stay open together, pay attention to what's happening between us, and the relationship will create the healing, which we know is a fact because endless research has confirmed it.
I remember that also in your Gestalt training, you focus also quite a lot on shifts, like what's changed or shifted. Because I think there's something about as we support our clients to expand their sense of awareness through the use of self, and I'll come back to some of the ways one could do that. Once we become aware of something, obviously you no longer can unsee it, and the mere awareness of it usually shifts something. Something happens, no matter how big or small, and kind of helping our clients to also realize some of those shifts can be quite profound.
And that's based on the paradox of change. So if we stay present and aware, if we go with this, change will happen. And part of our job as the coach or Gestalt coach is to catch those moments of change and emphasize them, give them space, allow them to open up and expand and pay attention. I was doing a little demo the other day and the guy was being very energetic. And then as we stayed with the energy and he explored the freedom that he got from the energy, a moment, then he suddenly went quite still. And I could feel myself, as I stayed with him, moving from that energetic place to being quite calm and still. And I said, it's interesting. I'm feeling really calm now, having been energetic. And he said, yes. Yeah, now you mention it, I am. Something had shifted in him in the expression, as we would expect. And he arrived at a more centered place. I did nothing except follow him and join him with his excitement and then with his calmness. So, some respects, I did nothing other than just be there. That's the beauty of it.
A lovely example, because it sounds like you were very much in tune, though. You weren't distracted. You were so focused with your client and what's happening that it allowed this to show up, to emerge.
Yes, it's a lovely expression there, being in tune, because you're connecting and you're vibrating together like singing with a tuning fork. You can feel the movement, and I know you do a lot of singing, so this will be close to your heart. But when you're in tune and in harmony, it's the connections that build the richness. And I hadn't thought of it before, but it is like us, we're together singing together like a duet. And I'm adding a harmony to enrich the song, the music. And I guess that's what's happening. And of course, if you're a little bit out of tune or discorded, then you're having to adjust and find the connection again.
But even those can be beautiful. So if we stay with the music, I'm in a choir, so we have at least 4 different voices that are singing and different harmonies, and one group has the melody. And sometimes certain voices have tunes that seem off on purpose, just because all of a sudden you're paying attention. Do you know what I mean? Like when you hear that, you're like, oh, what's going on? And I think in coaching, I can imagine that even if I were to share something and it doesn't land, that's still really useful information. If a client says, no, I'm not angry, I'm frustrated, or I'm actually sad, wonderful.
Yes.
Right? They don't have to agree. It doesn't have to always be fully in sync.
Yes. And those are often the most exciting and a little bit scary for the coach when it feels as if you are saying something that isn't quite aligned to what's been spoken about. I remember having a supervisor, and he was telling me all about how wonderful the sessions were and what he was getting out of it and what he was learning. This was very good, lovely stuff. I could hardly stay awake. I was practically falling asleep, and I was thinking, oh no, what's the matter with me? I didn't have a late night, and I like this person. Why would I be bored? And I listened for a while, and then finally I said, look, I have to share with you that, what you're saying is fantastic, but I'm somehow not feeling in touch and in tune, and I'm struggling paying attention. And he stopped, and he was a little bit shocked, but he said, I'm worried that if I tell you what I'm doing wrong, you'll think less of me. And he'd been my student previously in a training program. And so really what I'm telling you is what's really working well, so that you will think better of me. And what I'm not saying is the stuff that's a mess. Immediately, I was right there, right beside him, with his willingness to be so honest, to disclose his anxiety about my judgments of him from past experience as a trainer. And that felt, when I said, look, I'm sorry, I'm not paying, I can't get the attention, that was really discordant. And he experienced that. But suddenly, as you've said, that opens up a whole other dimension and level of honesty. And how many times have coaches sat through hour after hour of clients that they have lost interest in, and they don't know what to do about it? And this is where Gestalt has the opportunity, and the use of self is to have the courage to say, look, the impact you're having on me is that I'm falling asleep. Oh dear, can I say that? No, that's a terrible thing to say. But that's the reality. And you can try putting it another way. I never, ever use I'm bored because that is so pejorative. I would only ever use that if I was really wanting to be provocative, because the idea is that I am not telling you what you're doing. I'm telling you about the impact you have on me, which is partly my responsibility. It's my stuff that I'm going to sleep, but it's my stuff in relation to the stuff you're giving me in this case. And numerous examples of that. And as we say, the discord, when it feels like you're out of tune, out of step, can be some of the most profound moments and really worth paying attention to and trusting that it is a valuable information. The other thing, of course, is that what you're telling them is probably what other people in their team, their bosses or are thinking. This guy is going on and on and on about how wonderful things are. Why don't we get to the nitty gritty? But they're not going to say that because he's the boss. So it's fairly likely that what's going on between you is replicated elsewhere in their work together. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for using yourself to contribute to the client's awareness and their development.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I love about this example, John, is that actually because you showed honesty yourself. So again, we come back to this congruence. So you showed vulnerability and honesty in that moment with your client. It was an indirect invitation to also for them then to be able to show honesty and vulnerability in that moment and say, well, actually, that's what's happening.
It is. Yes, it was. It did actually take quite a lot of courage because, and I kept trying to think of ways of keeping myself awake and finding things that were interesting. How many, and I'm talking to the audience, how many coachees have you had that are chatting away? You might even say rambling away. And you're thinking, God, no, not another hour of just hearing them tell me some idea or concept or thought or problem. And you put up with it because you're not supposed to direct your client.
Yes, or interrupt.
Well, yes, of course. You know me, I always tell my students, and I've said to you many times, you're not interrupting, you're contributing. You're offering something of yourself, and that's a gift. You're being generous to contribute. I think people interrupt whenever they're asking questions, especially powerful questions. Then you're not joining in the flow. You're interrupting with your question.
That's a really interesting, I've never thought of it this way, John.
I hadn't thought of it till now either.
Write it down for your next
Write
class,
it down quickly.
Yeah, it's a really good thing to reflect on. Just, am I interrupting something, even with my question, with the flow?
Yes, actually, that's rather nice. I'm glad I just thought of that. That your question can be more of an interruption because you're cutting across. I mean, obviously, really good questions go with the flow, but then your offering of yourself, if you're really in tune, then it will be a joining. And this does not work if you're pretending. You really do have to engage. And it does take some practice because you're unlearning a whole stack of basic coaching stuff, which is about not directing the client. And I fully support all of that in the first instance because most managers and consultants are taught that they have to give advice. We've got to get somewhere. You've got to contribute something. So there is a tendency within the managerial leadership structure to be giving advice and directing. And our coaching 101 is to get you out of that habit. But then we're coming back in with something much, much more subtle and much more profound. It does take a bit of time to learn and understand how you can bring yourself, use yourself for the benefit of the client.
I guess there are levels to this, John. Like I remember you oftentimes speak about these, there's I think it was perceptual, resonance, cognitive resonance. and the somatic. And the example you gave was, I guess, in that third somatic level in terms, because I'm sharing my feelings and maybe how it feels, how my body is impacted by what I heard or what's been said. But the perceptual one already is a great start, I guess, where I'm simply mirroring not just what's being said, but maybe also facial expressions, a movement with the hand, a voice tone, and mirroring that. And so, oh, I noticed that this change, or that you're speaking very low all of a sudden. So that could be maybe a first lower threshold to maybe start experimenting with the use of self.
So let me first pick up on that word resonance that you've used, because that's a word that I love. It fits with the in tune. It's we're connecting, we're resonating together. And therefore, what I call perceptual resonance is using your perception, basically what you see and hear, because we're not chefs. So we don't do a lot of tasting of or with our clients. And we don't do much touching either because we're not physios. So primarily it's what we see and what we hear. And we're allowing what we see and hear to resonate within us. And then you can offer that as what you see and hear, what I hear, what your tone of voice. Now, most coaches are very familiar with that. Then there's a level of when you're resonating cognitively, when the ideas that one person is sharing sparks off ideas in yourself. And we generally call that brainstorming, where we share ideas. And again, if your coachee is sharing an idea, you might have an idea as well. You might have a thought, you might have an image or a metaphor that pops up. They're talking about feeling stuck, and you have the idea of wheels spinning in mud, for instance. Totally your idea based on what they say about being stuck. Now, you might say, so do you have a metaphor for that? That's obviously a question. You're inviting them to explore the image or metaphor. But you may well, which I think is richer, share the image that comes up to me is wheels spinning in mud. That's how I receive what you're saying. The client then has said, well, maybe not quite spinning, but feeling as if I'm dragging myself through it and not getting anywhere. So you're sharing your ideas, your thoughts, the way you see things unfolding. Now, again, there's lots of cautions around how you do that and to make sure that this is my idea, this is my thought. So that's what I call the cognitive resonance. And then the somatic resonance is what happens in my body as I listen to the other. So in my example, my body was tired, was exhausted. I was aware of that internal flatness in myself. And I found the way of contextualizing and sharing that in myself. And if I have any other sensation like excitement or delight, I'm just as likely to share that as well. In fact, even more. So I'm bringing my somatic experience into the relationship. But to do that, it does depend on the being in tune. That's the key factor. It's about finding that connection, that relationship where you are, well, coming back over and over again to feeling connected with the other, so that what's resonating within you is fairly likely to be something that's significant to the other.
I think what I'm hearing there, John, is that it's at the essence of this is a way of being and not a way of doing. It's very easy to take these types of resonance and think of them as a tool, but actually that's not where this is coming from. It's coming from a sense of being with the client, and out of that connection and being with them, some of these things may or may not show up.
Yeah, absolutely. And the basis of the bulk of coaching, performance coaching, is about doing. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? What's the solution you need? What are the actions? Going for outcome focus. Fine, absolutely fine. But it does not help with the being. Who am I? What's my experience of life in this job, in this role? What about my confidence, my lack of presence? All of these aspects of the coaching apply to who am I and how do I show up? And performance coaching is not very effective in this way. This is where Gestalt excels, and Gestalt isn't very effective in performance coaching. So you really need to find the mix. As you were asking me earlier, where is the function of goals in Gestalt coaching? Well, it doesn't really figure. You have to go somewhere else to address the goals aspect of it. So really, I'm encouraging people to use Gestalt in the service of their practice. And you'll recall my coaching sandwich metaphor that I use here. I see the beginning of the coaching very much about setting the scene, the bread. The core bit that holds the session together is the bread. And it's about setting the scene, the tone, building the relationship, getting into that attunement. And then you've got the filling, the essence of what the coaching work is all about. And that is what's happening between you in the moment. Those are those deep, profound moments where there are shifts occurring. Traditionally, you ask powerful questions that would evoke those shifts. In Gestalt, we're sharing ourselves in that moment. In the grow model, that's the reality and the options. That's the body of the work. And then you got the other piece of bread on the other side, which holds it together, which is what are you going to do with it? What are the resources you have? The standard stuff in the grow model would be the W, the way forward. Although I prefer John Whitmore's version, the original version, where he talked about will and the notion of the energy that you have to carry it forward. We use now way forward because it's become very action focused, whereas John Whitmore was a psychosynthesis therapist, and will is very much the intention of going forward rather than the actions themselves. But that doesn't matter. It's still about how are you going to move forward with this. So I encourage coaches to use this use of self and this the quality of engagement in the middle part of your coaching session. And that might just be 5 minutes. As a primarily Gestalt focused coach in a 1 hour session, it's more likely to be 40 minutes of my coaching and 10 minutes either side to top and tail. But as you become more experienced and you're confident in this, that time expands because it's so much more fun. It's great to be alongside your client and enjoying the work together with them.
It certainly feels more real to me. Let's put it this way. I think real, feels more authentic and real.
Because you're being yourself. It's two people coming together to build the awareness of one, primarily the awareness of one.
Yes. Let me ask you this then, because I can imagine some of the coaches listening to us saying, well, it sounds amazing. I'd love to give this a go, but I'm not quite sure where to start because that's not how I've been taught to coach. And the other question I can hear is maybe, and what if I get this wrong? What if I end up doing harm? What if I trigger something and I don't know where to take it from there? What would you tell them?
Well, of course, that can happen with your questions. You ask a question can do just the same damage. Although I do remember when I was starting my Gestalt psychotherapy training, I asked my trainer about, I'm worried about doing damage. And he said, John, you don't have anywhere near enough experience to do any damage. Your client has been developing these strategies for living for whatever it is, 30, 40, 50 years. You think you can actually have that much impact? Yeah. So that was quite refreshing in a way, not to worry about getting it wrong. But if you trust that you are offering a gift, this is the mentality you've got to get into. It's never wrong. It can't be wrong because it's your perception. That's your reaction. Even the notion of right or wrong doesn't even come into it, because if you say, I'm picturing this balloon, and I say, well, my image is blue, that's not wrong. She says, well, no, mine's red. I said, well, fine, you're red, I'm blue. Okay, I'm going to follow yours. I'm going to turn mine from blue to red because I'm going to follow yours. So you don't have to worry about being wrong, provided you come from the position of offering without attachment as a gift in service of the client. So for all of you listeners, just try it out. Instead of asking a question, simply share the thinking behind the question. You can still ask the question. You can say, look, who painted that picture? Because, oh yeah, I really like it because what I see in this, that you can ask the question, then you can fill in your version of it and see what happens. The worst that happens is they say, no, that's not my picture. This is mine. And what have you wasted? Well, I don't think you've wasted anything, but probably maximum 10 seconds. The damage comes, and this is what I learned as I became more experienced as a psychotherapist and a coach. The damage comes with complacency and thinking that you're right. And when you look at, I was part of the Psychotherapy Institute and the accreditation of psychotherapists and the complaints procedures for complaints. Complaints come from much older, experienced therapists that think they're right. They've been there, done it. They think they know it's right. And they are saying it. They're making their intervention with the belief that they are correct. And that's when it goes wrong. I don't believe you can go wrong. And I've now been supervising and practicing coaching for 20 odd years. And I've not seen it go wrong if you come from genuine authenticity.
You mentioned a book to me once, John, Risking Being Alive.
Yes.
I couldn't find a copy that it's very difficult, but I came across a poem by William Arthur Ward, just briefly, because I know we'll have to come to a close soon. I want to read it to you and just hear what your experience of it is, John. So this poem is called Risks. And he says, to laugh is to risk appearing the fool. To weep is to risk appearing sentimental. To reach out for another is to risk exposing your true self. To place your ideas, your dreams before a crowd is to risk their loss. To love is to risk not being loved in return. To live is to risk dying. To hope is to risk despair. To try is to risk failure. But risks must be taken because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing.
Yes.
The person who risks nothing, does nothing, has nothing, and is nothing. They may avoid suffering and sorrow, but they cannot learn, feel, change, grow, love, or live. Chained by their attitudes, they are a slave. They have forfeited their freedom. Only a person who risks is free.
Lovely. Perfect. Yes, risking being alive. That's beautiful, beautiful, and encapsulates exactly what I'm saying, that we take the risk to be engaged with our clients. And that requires courage. Really, I think what I'm teaching in my Gestalt programs is courage. Courage to be yourself, to show up, to communicate, to connect, and also to know yourself, because that's the other kind of scary bit. If it's my stuff, I've got to know my stuff. I've got to be careful that in the sharing of my stuff that I am not imposing on it. I have my biases, but I am not aware enough of my biases. So there's a whole lot of self-work that needs to be done in order to operate this way. You're clearing yourself out so that the triggers that happen in you, you're pretty familiar with. So your poem is absolutely beautiful and amazing, and it really encapsulates all that we're talking about taking risks and unblocking the flow to engagement and connection.
I love what you mentioned about self-awareness, because that is so key, and our continued self-development is incredibly key, especially if we want to go into a place of being versus doing coaching. And as a little segue for our listeners, so the second episode after this one that will air is with Mariah Eiliff-Wood, and we go quite a bit actually into that and what could be ways for coaches. So for our listeners, be sure to tune into episode 2
Yes.
and listen to it. It's also quite fascinating. John, I could speak to you for ages,
Yep.
but sadly we will have to start wrapping this up. So I can imagine that some of our listeners might be curious after this to maybe learn more about your work, get in touch with you. What could be a good way for them to do so?
My email address is john@gestalt.uk. Also, my book, Fertile Void, Gestalt Coaching at Work. I've put a lot of attention into making Gestalt accessible in this way. So there are loads of clearly outlined theories and then practices and examples and things to do. So if you're interested, just get the book on Amazon, Fertile Void, risking being alive. That's another book, unfortunately, out of print, Gestalt book, Gestalt Coaching at Work. And I also run 2-day foundation programs in Gestalt with the Academy of Executive Coaching. So if you want to find out about that, just go to www.aoec.com and join me on one of those 2-day. They're virtual and they're fun to do. Huge amount of experiential work.
Yes, I can only recommend them.
Thank you.
For transparency, sometimes I support John. So I've gone through them, of course. And sometimes I support John on these trainings. And every time I learn something, John, it's just every time there's richness to them. So absolutely great. I think you have one coming up in November. I don't know if it's already fully booked on the 25th.
Yeah, 25th and 26th of November. 2024. Of course, if you're listening to this in 2026, this will be absolutely useless to you.
True.
There will be a version coming up. I'm sure I'll still be here if you're listening in 2026, 28.
Sounds great. So as we come to a close, John, is there anything that's unsaid that you feel should be said before we close?
Oh, well, how long are you giving me? I think I've said more than enough for now. I guess the only thing is to encourage you listeners to have a go. And I want to make it as simple as sharing the statement behind your question. That's all. Try it out and keep trying it and experimenting. Even if you want to frame it as part of your contracting, you're going to share a bit more of yourself. Do that and then have a go. Because as the poem says, unless you risk something, you're not going to learn anything. So that's my encouragement for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. It's been a huge pleasure.
Pleasure.
Great to have you here.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and live events featuring the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.